The winter in the high country came early that year, sliding down from the mountains like a white curtain pulled across the land. Snow settled on the trees and the cabins, filling the narrow paths with drifts and choking the trails that led toward the settlements. For Helen Markham, the change meant only more silence. She had grown used to silence in her cabin on the edge of the woods. Years had worn her into a creature of solitude, her life reduced to the rhythm of cutting wood, drawing water, and keeping the fire alive. She had not expected anyone to come to her door in that storm, yet on one bitter afternoon a knock echoed across the room. It was not timid. It was firm, measured, as if the one knocking knew she was there and knew she could not ignore it. She opened the door to find two figures in the snow. The older one was bent with sickness, his breath ragged in the cold air. The younger stood tall, his hand steadying the elder, his dark eyes fixed on her without a flicker of doubt. They were strangers to her, but not strangers in the eyes of the settlement. She recognized them by their dress, their hair, their faces. Apaches. Helen's heart leapt. She knew what their presence meant. To shelter them would be to declare herself against the settlement. And yet standing there, she did not hesitate. She stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside, the old man sank onto the bench near the fire. His son, she assumed it was his son, helped him remove his coat and settle into the warmth. The younger man's movements were precise, careful, but he said nothing. Helen, still holding the edge of the door, studied him. There was no plea in his face, no request for charity, only calm resolve, as if he had already known she would not turn them away. "Sit," she said at last, though they had already done so. Her voice sounded unfamiliar in her own ears. It had been days since she had spoken aloud. The old man's breathing filled the cabin with its wheeze. The son, later she would learn his name was Newell, kept his eyes on the fire. For hours they sat in silence. Helen went about her chores, but her mind was a storm. What would the settlement say if they learned of this? She did not need to imagine. She already knew. 2 days later, while cutting kindling outside, she saw a group of riders through the trees. At their head was Ezra Pike, a man whose name was spat in whispers but whose presence was never challenged. Pike had the look of a man who believed the land belonged only to him and his kind. He reined in his horse at the sight of her. "You seen any Injuns pass this way?" he asked, his voice like gravel. Helen's throat tightened. The lie came quicker than she expected. No. Pike's eyes narrowed, scanning her face. He knew, she could feel it. Yet he said nothing more. He spat into the snow, turned his horse, and the group rode on. When she returned to the cabin, Newell was standing by the window. He had heard every word. For a moment their eyes locked, and though neither spoke, something passed between them. Not gratitude, he did not seem the kind to offer that, but recognition. She had chosen, and he had seen it. Nights grew longer. The storm did not relent. The old man, whose name was Whitefeather, drifted between waking and feverish dreams. Newell tended him with a quiet devotion that surprised Helen. She had lived years watching people die. Her husband, her child, neighbors taken by sickness or the harshness of the land. But she had never seen care like this. His hands were gentle, his patience endless. One evening, as she mended a torn sleeve by the fire, Newell spoke for the first time more than a handful of words. "You been alone long?" His English was rough but clear. Helen set down her work. The question pierced deeper than he could know. "Too long," she answered. He nodded as if that explained everything, and in a way, it did. After that, their silences changed. They were no longer the silences of strangers, but of people who understood the weight of words. Helen began to listen for his breath at night, to take comfort in the sound of another life in the cabin. It frightened her how much she welcomed it. But Pike was not finished. Word had spread in the settlement, whispered in the corners of the store, carried on the lips of women who avoided her gaze. Helen felt it when she walked into town, the eyes that followed, the muttered curses, the hiss of witch or traitor. A boy once threw a clump of snow at her and shouted the word witch aloud before running off. She carried her supplies home in silence, but inside she trembled. That evening, she placed the bundle of goods on the table without a word. Newell watched her for a long time before returning to his task of slicing meat. He did not ask, did not press. His refusal to give weight to the settlement's hatred was its own shield. Yet the threat drew nearer. One night, long after the fire had burned low, Helen heard the thud of hooves. Pike again, but this time not alone. She counted at least 5 shadows outside the cabin. Their voices carried through the wood. "Open up, Helen," Pike shouted. "We know they're inside." Her hands shook, but she stood. Newell moved beside her, a knife glinting in his fist. His face was unreadable, but his presence steadied her. "You've no right," Helen called back through the door. "This is my home." "You're hiding an enemy," Pike answered. "That makes you one too." Her heart pounded. She thought of the fire, the years of solitude, the bitterness she had worn like armor. And then she thought of the old man breathing raggedly on the bench, and of Newell standing beside her, calm as stone. "I'm sheltering a man," she said at last. "Not an enemy, a man." There was a long pause. She heard murmurs, the shuffle of boots in snow. Newell's grip on the knife did not waver. At last, Pike spat a curse. "This isn't over." And they were gone. Helen sagged against the door, her strength spent. She looked at Newell. He did not thank her. He only looked at her with those steady, dark eyes, and she felt the weight of her choice settle deep within her. For the first time in years, she wanted to weep. The storm outside raged on. Inside, the silence had changed forever. After that night, nothing in Helen's life felt the same. The memory of Pike's voice at the door stayed with her like a stone in her chest. She knew he would come again, and she knew that when he did, words might no longer be enough to send him away. Inside the cabin, however, time moved at its own rhythm. Whitefeather grew weaker by the day. His breaths came shallow and uneven, his body shrinking against the blanket that covered him. Helen had seen death approach before. She recognized its slow, patient steps, and yet she had never seen a son meet it as Newell did, with quiet loyalty, with the kind of care that seemed less like duty and more like reverence. Sometimes Helen would watch as he held a cup of water to his father's lips, his large hand steady even when the old man trembled. Sometimes she would hear him murmur words in the Apache tongue, soft and low. She did not understand them, but she understood the tone: comfort, respect, love. The settlement, meanwhile, grew harsher toward her. When she went into town for supplies, the women turned their faces away. The men spoke louder when she passed, making sure she heard their contempt. One morning in the store, Martha Kellum blocked her path. Martha was tall, with a narrow face that pinched tighter when she was angry, which was often. "You're still keeping them?" Martha asked, her voice sharp enough to cut. Helen held her ground. "I am." "Then you're no better than them." The word stung, though Helen kept her face calm. She bought what she needed and left without another glance, but the venom of Martha's voice followed her all the way home. When she returned, Newell was outside splitting wood. His axe rose and fell with precise rhythm, chips of pine flying into the snow. He looked up as she came, his gaze meeting hers for a brief, steady moment. He said nothing, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with something she could lean against, something strong. That night, as she lay awake listening to his breathing across the room, Helen admitted to herself what she feared most. It wasn't Pike, it wasn't Martha. It was the thought of losing the small flame of connection that had kindled between her and Newell. She had lived so long in solitude that she thought it was all she deserved. Now, for the first time, she was afraid of going back to it. Winter deepened. The snow outside rose high against the cabin walls, muffling the world in silence. In that silence, life inside the cabin became almost bearable, even tender. They shared the chores, feeding the fire, cooking meals, carrying water when they could break through the ice at the creek. Helen found herself listening for Newell's footsteps, for the steady sound of his work. One evening, while she patched a hole in her skirt, Newell spoke. "The people," he said quietly, "they will not stop." Helen looked up. His voice was calm, but his eyes held warning. "I know," she said. "I've lived with their scorn before. This is different." She wanted to ask what he meant, but he returned to tending the fire, and she let the words hang in the air. Deep down, she understood. Days later, as Whitefeather drifted in and out of restless dreams, Helen heard him murmur something in Apache. His voice was faint but clear. Newell leaned close to listen, nodding slowly. Then the old man turned his gaze to Helen. His lips moved again, and though she could not understand the words, she knew they were about her. Newell's eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment she felt the weight of being seen, truly seen by both father and son. Still, the threat outside grew nearer. The riders returned. She heard them one evening on the ridge, their shouts carrying through the snow. They did not approach the cabin, but their presence was a warning. She and Newell shared no words about it, yet the knowledge lived between them, unspoken. One morning, Helen ventured alone into town. Newell had stayed behind with his father. The road was thick with snow, each step a battle. When she arrived, the settlement was quiet but watchful. Inside the store, Martha intercepted her again. "You're digging your own grave," Martha said coldly. "When that old Indian dies, his son will leave you. And then what will you be? Nothing. Less than nothing." Helen clenched her jaw. "Maybe that's still better than being like you." The word surprised even her. She left without waiting for a reply, her hands trembling as she carried her bundle back through the snow. When she reached the cabin, Newell was waiting outside. He had built a neat stack of wood, the axe buried in the stump beside it. He watched her with that same steady gaze, and she felt her anger melt into something else, something heavier, more fragile. That night she could not sleep. The fire glowed low, and in the quiet she heard Newell breathing near the hearth. She realized with sudden clarity that she was no longer afraid of Pike or the settlement. She was afraid of her own heart, of the way it had begun to lean toward his presence. She had not felt such closeness in years, and it terrified her. But she could not push it away. Winter held them prisoner, but in that prison they found a strange kind of freedom. The chores, the silence, the care for Whitefeather bound them together like threads of a net. Helen no longer felt the empty echo of loneliness in her chest. She felt instead the pulse of another life close to her own. The settlement might call her cursed, a witch, a traitor. Martha's words might poison the air. Pike's threats might hover like a shadow over the cabin. But none of it could erase what she had found. For the first time in years, Helen felt herself drawn toward something warmer than survival. And she knew, with a mixture of dread and longing, that it was Newell. The storm finally broke, but the cold stayed sharp as a blade. Snow glittered under the pale sun, and the cabin stood alone against the white fields, a stubborn mark of life in a land that seemed determined to bury it. Inside, Helen felt the weight of each day more heavily. Whitefeather's breath was fading like a candle in wind. She could see it in the way his eyes wandered, in the stillness of his hands. Death was near. One morning, as she offered him a cup of water, his gaze cleared for a moment. He looked at her steadily and whispered, "You are strong." His voice was thin, but the words struck deep. In all her years among the settlers, no one had ever spoken them to her. To them she was cursed, stubborn, strange. To him she was strong. She carried those words like a secret fire. When Whitefeather's time finally came, it was gentle. Just before dawn, with snow still falling in the half-light, his chest rose one last time and stilled. Helen held his hand, and though her eyes burned with tears, she did not cry. She looked at Newell, who sat quietly beside his father. He did not wail or strike his fists against the wall. He only bowed his head, the silence around him deeper than grief itself. Together they buried Whitefeather on the hill behind the cabin, where the earth rose to meet the sun. Newell dug the grave himself, his shoulders straining with each stroke of the spade. Helen helped carry the blankets and lay them over the body. They stood side by side as the snow began to fall again, covering the mound with a thin veil. Helen whispered a prayer, not the kind the preachers in town would approve of, but her own. For once, she did not care who might hear. That night, Newell sat by the fire staring into the flames. Helen sat across from him, mending a tear in her shawl, but her hands soon fell still. She watched him, the hard lines of his face softened by firelight, his eyes fixed on something far away. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, that might touch the place where his silence lived. But no words came. In the end, she simply shared the silence with him. It wasn't long before Pike returned. He came with 4 men, their boots crunching in the snow, their rifles glinting in the pale light. The knock on the door was hard enough to rattle the hinges. When Helen opened it, Pike stood there with that cruel smile she knew too well. "We hear the old one's gone," he said. "That leaves just the son." "Hand him over." Helen's grip on the doorframe tightened. "He's no prisoner here," she said. "He stays. He's Apache," Pike snapped. "That's all we need to know." "You think we'll let him walk around free while our people live in fear?" Behind her, Newell appeared, tall and calm. He had no weapon in his hands, but the strength in his presence was enough to make Pike hesitate. His silence, his refusal to beg or bow, carried more weight than words. Pike's eyes slid back to Helen. "You'd throw away what little you have left for him? Do you even know what you're doing?" Helen felt her heart hammering in her chest. She looked at Newell, then back at Pike. "If you want him, you'll have to come through me." For a long moment, the world seemed to freeze. The men behind Pike shifted, uneasy. None wanted to strike a woman, not here, not now. Pike scowled, spitting into the snow. "This is the last chance you'll get," he warned. "You're digging your own grave." And then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off with the others. When the sound of hooves faded, Helen sagged against the wall. She hadn't realized how much she was trembling until Newell steadied her with his hands. Strong, warm, certain, she pressed against him for a moment, her cheek against his chest, and heard the steady beat of his heart. It was the most comforting sound she had ever known. From that night on, the air between them changed. The fear was still there, a shadow at the window, but it no longer ruled her. What filled her instead was the quiet strength of Newell's presence. She caught his gaze sometimes, saw the depth in his dark eyes, and felt a peace she had never known. One afternoon, while they worked mending the fence outside, Helen finally let the question slip. "When you leave, will I be alone again?" He stopped, the hammer still in his hand. He studied her for a long time before answering. "I will not leave." She blinked, the tears burning hot behind her eyes. She had forgotten what it felt like to cry, but the words broke something open inside her. It was a promise, simple and plain, yet it struck deeper than any vow. The days turned slowly, winter loosening its grip little by little. Snow still clung to the ground, but the sun lingered longer, and the air smelled faintly of thaw. The world outside the cabin would never forgive her. She knew Martha's whispers would spread, that Pike's threats might return. But within the cabin walls, she had found something no gossip, no scorn, no hatred could take. She had found a man who saw her not as cursed or broken, but as strong. She had found a bond forged not from words, but from silence and survival, from fire shared on the coldest nights. And she had found, against all odds, the end of her loneliness. That night, while the wind moaned around the cabin, they sat by the fire once more. Helen's hand found Newell's, and his fingers closed around hers with quiet certainty. No words were needed. The storm could rage outside, the settlement could whisper and curse, Pike could come back with all his threats. None of it mattered. In the warmth of his hand, in the steady beat of his heart, Helen knew she had finally come home.